Welcome one, welcome all to the Politics of Cinema. On this show, we believe films are never ever neutral. There's a political as well as artistic message captured, sometimes on purpose, sometimes on accident in every film, and we are on the lookout for all of it. My name is Aaron Spears.
And I'm Isaac Miller. And on this episode, we are celebrating May Day with 3 labor films. Bill Duke's The Killing Floor from 1984, Ron Howard's Gung Ho from 1986, and finally got the news from 1970. Yeah, I'm just thinking in the 80s. I'm kind of stuck in the 80s now. By Stuart Beard, Peter Gessner, Renee Lichtman, and John Lewis Jr.
Yeah, we were we need to get out of the 80s after this this episode, Isaac, because it's too much right now.
It's weird. It's not intentional.
No.
I like the 80s a lot more than you, but it's neither of our favorite decade.
Well, it's definitely interesting and worth exploring. But yeah, there's a lot more out there. I want to be exploring. So, well, I know for a fact my next one's going to be the 70s. So
yeah,
we will, once we get through this chunk of the 80s. This is an interesting kind of cross section of 80s though. That I'm interested to kind of smash two of these films together to see what comes of the conversation. But before we jump into that, this episode is coming out May 1st. Off of our normal schedule for a very, very good reason. There's a long, I would say, more international history to May Day than in the States, but hopefully that'll change over time.
Well, May Day is International Workers' Day, right? It is the day where anti-capitalists of all kinds and labor movements all over the world celebrate the power of workers to change their world into something better. And of course, it originates in the late 19th century in Chicago, from the Haymarket riots and the Haymarket massacre. So its origins are in the United States, but it's not celebrated here by and large. I remember the first time I actually had May Day as a holiday was in Amman, Jordan.
Really?
In the Middle East. Yeah, no, I mean, it was like amazing, right? And this is not a country with frankly, in which the labor movement is allowed to operate openly or, in a way that the government doesn't control or repress.
Right.
And yet here I was celebrating May Day because it's just normal in the rest of the world, or a lot of the rest of it.
Yeah.
So, but we decided we'd have a May Day special because last year, which is our first year doing the podcast, we missed May Day. We are a political podcast, and I think let's say we're not exactly we're not really liberals on this podcast, and we're certainly not on the right.
No,
we tend to be more radical. So May Day is important, but not only that, this entire month is going to be nothing but labor themed movies, and of course, our watch challenge for this month also involves labor.
Right, we're singularly focused for the month of May this year, and in years going forward as well. I guess we were just too focused on the films last May. No, we weren't too focused on the films last May. We were in a fucking global pandemic last May, which is still going on. But we were a little distracted.
We were a little distracted. I remember we were like midway through May, and I was like, God damn it, we have a podcast. We need to do a May Day episode. It's interesting. So it's like, no, this year we're not missing this shit. It's happening.
Yeah, there was no real planning ahead last year. It was like, what can we watch for comfort as the world falls apart all around us?
I think we literally were doing Corona Comfort Cinema. Right?
We were right in the middle of that. There's a lot of film noir and Thai action films and stuff. So, but missed the boat. But we're back on the boat this year. We're a little bit more focused. Yeah, I guess I had read previously the Chicago origins and the Haymarket riot. My only exposure to May Day has been through foreign films that incorporate it as part of the plot, usually French films, things like that. So I've never been around any kind of celebration on May 1st. For some reason in America, we seem to focus a little bit more on May the 4th than we do on May 1st. Hopefully that changes at some point, but no, that's why I was a little taken aback when you said Jordan. I was like, oh, that doesn't seem like the place where you'd have a May Day celebration, but I'm glad they do. That's really good to hear.
Well, it wasn't even really a celebration, honestly. It was just like
observation of it. Sorry, whatever.
Yeah. There was actual observation. Well, this is a really messed up country. I mean, this is a country where, the the right of the political spectrum takes the color red, and where you don't celebrate the labor holiday that actually has its origins in your country.
Right.
And I living abroad for years, you start to realize that like Americans and American leftists have this sort of attitude of like, the U.S. is uniquely reactionary, and the U.S. is everywhere is uniquely something.
Right.
But there's a lot of ways where the U.S. is actually not as unique as Americans tend to think it is on the right or the left. But this is one of those areas where it's pretty weird.
What do you mean?
I just mean in the aspects that we were just talking about, where it's because it has a history of never having a strong. I mean, there's a long history of socialists and communists and so forth movements, but it's never been nearly as strong as it was in much of the rest of the world as sort of a mainstream thing.
Oh, yeah. I see what you
These
mean.
things just to not be part of it. And it's interesting just to sideline into our movies. I mean, we'll be dealing with some of that history in some of these movies. I think some of the major reasons why it's been hard to build a socialist movement and a labor movement that had a direct tie to anti-capitalist movements, which is sort of standard in a lot of the world.
Hmm.
And I know that we're going to be choosing our industrial themes actually because we're both doing different things throughout the month. This episode, we're dealing with factory movies,
Right.
basically consistently.
Well, and the first one to jump in is set in Chicago, not the time period you're talking about with the Haymarket riot, but Chicago. Very interesting depiction of labor unions based on actual fact during World War One. But that it is interesting. It was just sort of a happy little coincidence that one of the films is actually set in Chicago, as you were just referencing the origins of the day in and of itself as well.
Yeah. So this is The Killing Floor by Bill Duke. It's Bill, who I feel silly. I didn't realize how much of a director he was. That really his main
I
gig as a
didn't
director.
either. It's crazy. He has a huge list of accomplishments in directing.
Yeah, and I just know him for 80s action movies, which is embarrassing.
Is this when you're going to talk about how we need to watch Predator again?
We are going to watch Predator probably this month. This man has not seen Predator.
I have not seen Predator, but no, I'm moving out of the '80s, so we're not watching Predator recently. No, I mean, people know Bill Duke as a character actor because he's been in what is it, 72 credits on IMDb as an actor, 61 as director. I did not know that before we watched this movie.
Yeah, I mean, and when it's at that level, that's kind of, I don't know how he sees himself, but that feels like that's his main gig. Is as a director. It's just that I think some of his character actor roles have been
iconic,
absolutely iconic. So you just don't think of it. The Killing Floor, it's an interesting movie. It's a PBS movie from the mid '80s,
mm-hmm.
and it does as a visual style, right? You can tell this is a TV movie. But if you're talking about the quality of the acting and the quality of the material that you have,
mm-hmm.
it is, I think, a stunning piece of work.
It is
that you really feel. Just to give you a little bit of the praise. I mean, this came out on Criterion a few months ago, basically as a streaming premiere. It had, was sort of digging it out of the archives. There's a film. Oh, sorry, not film. There's a labor historian named Gabriel Winant, who I follow on Twitter, who watched it late. He just watched it a few weeks and he was like, "This is the best portrayal of American labor." Of the American labor movement on film there is, period. And he's doing that as a historian, not a film person.
Right. I mean, that's the stamp of approval you look for, especially me as a bit more of emphasis on the film aspect to it. I was like, well, if that stamp of approval is from a historian, I need to check out this movie.
Yeah. So what should we just give a brief synopsis and then dig in?
Oh, yeah, that sounds good. Because this is not necessarily a very well-known, I guess, movie. If people, I mean, it hit Criterion, so that definitely is getting a new audience and renewed look currently right now, which is great. As I mentioned, it's set during World War One, in which very, very poor black man, a Southerner, travels north to Chicago to get work in the he doesn't know it's gonna be the city's slaughterhouses, but that's where he finds work. He becomes embroiled in organized labor movement, and he becomes a prominent leader of the fellow African Americans within the Union, though many, including his best friend, do end up viewing him as a sellout.
Why don't we say it like this? The Lord has seen fit to reward me with a position at the Chicago Stockyards.
Yes, ma'am.
It's straight and simple, boys. We want everybody to join the union.
Mister, I come up here to make a living. I ain't getting in no white man's fight, no, sir.
Now get back to work, all of you.
You do whatever the boss says, don't you, boy?
Yeah, you ain't seen me in a whole year. You didn't bring me no flowers or nothing. But I guess that's what Chicago do to folks.
A lot of Irish gangs all up and through here. So you gotta be careful how you step.
See, there are all kinds of butchers. The stickers do like this.
The days of peasants and serfs and slaves must be behind us. Now we're Americans now. Polish, Irish, colored, whatever you are. Let us be 100% Union.
You just like one of them cows, eh? Going to the slaughter, cause the white man leads him to it.
How y'all colored folk doing?
How you doing, white boy?
They're gonna keep pushing us until we start killing each other.
Coloreds will be brought in by the militia.
You're gonna herd the coloreds into the yards like a bunch of cattle?
We was making progress up here.
Now there's nothing but fire and smoke.
I didn't ride that boxcar all the way up here to be the same as I left. I was nothing when I come up here. But I ain't gonna stay nothing.
Tomorrow, where you gonna be? Me and the Union gonna be outside the damn slaughterhouse trying to keep those people from coming in to kill the coloreds.
The premise really is that white men were heading overseas to fight World War I, so that opened up this new job market.
Right.
I think traditionally within very general view of American history, we think of that as like women took those roles in World War II, and then the whole labor force changed dramatically in World War II. But I was like, oh, this is really interesting. It's kind of the same approach, but this is the World War I story.
But the other thing is what it is. I mean, this is an accelerant to like what they call the Great Migration, which is, black, predominantly sharecroppers moving out of the South into the North, which is a process that takes decades, right?
That's true, yeah. Because eventually he was able to bring his whole family up too.
Right. So this is this is an important, historical process that he's taking part in.
Yeah.
And part of what this portrays is the incredible difficulty of interracial organizing. So part of it is what you're dealing with is a white labor force, which you have layers of immigrants, right? The oldest of which would be maybe the Germans or the Irish, who happen to be the leaders of the Union, right? You notice all the leaders of the Union are Irish. The rank and file white workers seem to be predominantly Polish, but also other Eastern European populations. So They don't speak English. And then the packers, right, the owners of the meat packing companies are very clear, are very, as they've done with every immigrant wave, are intentionally using black workers to break the union and courting them while also hyper exploiting them, right?
Right.
And you have unions which have really just realized the need to do interracial organizing, because traditionally the American labor movement, with some notable exceptions, I think the IWW, the Knights of Labor, has been segregated or does not allow black workers to join in at all. And the idea has been historically that black workers are just there as scabs, right? They're getting in the way. They're taking our jobs that we as white workers rightfully have. Mm. And so they're trying to get beyond that, but it is not easy. It is incredibly difficult. I mean, I don't know. What sort of, I mean, how do you sort of view the main character's arc in this movie?
That's a good question, because I was looking at it going, it starts off with like, there's opportunity. And so there's a certain energy to it. And like, he does find work, and it pays to a certain extent. I mean, he's not going to get rich working there, but he translates skills that he already has by, what does he mentions, like, slaughtering hogs, down on the farm or whatever. So it's work that he can get that provides enough money that he can move his whole family, as he's left, wife and kids back down south, and they're able to move up. They have, a decent place to live for, World War I era, also, in that area of Chicago as well. But there isn't fulfillment coming from the work itself. The way that Frank Custer, the lead here, Damian Leake, the way it's played, it seemed to me like he was getting more actual like personal satisfaction out of the union work or the union organizing that he was doing than like the work itself, which is kind of interesting. But because that didn't really pay off the way, because the end isn't like, and we formed a great, strong interracial union, and we've got great workers' rights, and we're like, it doesn't end that way.
And well, I think it's based off of a real journal, and it just ends.
Well, right, and it feels very real, and it's not an unsatisfying ending. I just meant it's not the Hollywood ending of like, you know, and we did it, we conquered the bosses.
I mean, well, yeah. I mean, well, it portrays the real moral complexity of a
Yeah,
situation in which the Union is struggling not to be racist, and we'll get to part of what happens. I mean, I think part of it is this: he comes up, and at first you're getting paid better than you've ever gotten paid, right?
yeah,
And you have, you know, you can buy things, you can buy new clothes, you know, whatever. You can sort of live, you know, live in a way, you know, it's the big city for one thing. But you very quickly realize that one, you're not being paid that much compared to cost, and two, this is a really dangerous job.
yeah.
Like you can, you know, they don't show any injuries, but you know, they mention it a lot. You can get cut, you can
Mhm.
fall from things, you can slip horribly. I mean, a lot of stuff can happen.
Well, also I got to say too, as the resident non-meat eater on this podcast, it's disgusting. I threw on the first few minutes of this movie. I was just watching it on because it's streaming, so I threw it on my computer when I was at work one day. I'm just drinking my smoothie at my lunch, and I was like, "Oh God!" Like they're just draining the blood of the, like it looks like a working stockyard. Like there's a lot of there's animals being butchered in this scene. There's blood on the floor. They're mopping it up. They're squeegeeing up. Like it's a disgusting slaughterhouse they're working in, and yeah, it looks insanely dangerous.
I mean, I think, you know, for a movie with, I think, a very limited budget, they do a good job of creating place.
Yeah, very much so. And I didn't find visually, I didn't see it as like a limited budget visually, although I kind of know what you're talking about. Maybe like, because whoever was doing the set design on whatever budget they had did a phenomenal job. It does, like you said, does have a little bit of a TV aesthetic, but not as much as I would have guessed from an 80s, you know, PBS movie. Cause like it's a World War I set, like all the period details
Are
seem very
perfect.
accurate to me at all. Like it's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, no, the period details are perfect. And, you know, I think it is helped by like a dynamite cast, right? Like
Oh,
it's
for sure.
but so, you know, part of what's interesting, I mean, it is the complexity of the relationship between, so I mean, he finds more dignity in joining the union, but most black workers, part of it is that you've got a predominantly white immigrant union, and most black workers do not feel welcomed. They do not feel, you know, they feel pressured, and they, you know, there's a long history of white-led unions excluding black workers, and so there is resentment there and deep suspicion, especially because you are getting better than you would have otherwise.
Right.
So he joins up, and he's able to befriend and build up these, you know, these real connections with these white workers. You can feel like there's the scene where he and his wife have gone over to one of the white workers who's become his friend's house, and there's a certain point where like this is where you see the seams, right, in these relationships.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
real
yeah.
relationships and they're real friendships, but they make a reference to basically the first wave of black workers who have been brought in, who've been used to lock out the white immigrant workers, had literally been living in the stockyard under the most disgusting and horrible conditions. And they're like, you know, that's horrifying. And their hosts are like, well, it's horrifying that they were scabs,
Right, yeah.
which is, you know, which is a standard position if you're in a labor, you know, if you're in the labor movement. I mean, there's nothing lower than a scab, but at the same time, like there is a complexity there, right?
Right.
There's a real difficulty to dealing with this, and I love the subtlety through which that's handled. And then, you know, basically, these are famous race riots begin, and but what's clear from that dinner is that yes, he is a genuine like brother in the union, but they also are very intentional about recruiting him because they need black workers who can recruit other black workers.
Right.
And he can do it, and he is doing it, but it's so fragile. And so when the race riots come, I mean, that is when things, for me, the black workers can't go to work because there's white neighborhoods in the way, and you see all those tensions and conflicted feelings boiling up. I mean, he's literally saying it right out loud. It's like he doesn't know what to do. And you see the Packers are literally sending food to black workers, and the union isn't doing anything, maybe because it can't. They say that they can't. So you can see like the divisions being sowed between this very fragile attempt at building labor movement, and you see it in Frank Custer, who is completely dedicated to the union,
Right.
but is also, I mean, we can sort of talk about where he gets to by the end of the movie. Also, feels pulled.
Mm-hmm. Well, because by the time you get to the end, we have like like you said, the race riots that are going on there. There is an entire, well, not entire, but there is a fully functioning economy going on, like stores and everything in the black neighborhood. There's even a one shop he goes to have someone write letters back home for him as a service. So like there are, I mean, it's a neighborhood with black owned businesses that are fully function operational. But at one point they even mentioned like he has to walk through a white Irish neighborhood to get to work. And it gets progressively more and more dangerous until the race riots actually do kick off. And it's this completely cordoned off neighborhood. And there's a taxi. Somebody just drives by shooting guns at a whole family on the stoop at one point. Like it's that dangerous where he can't leave the house at all. And then it becomes dire enough where it's like it calls into question to a certain extent, but the climax of the film is like, where is his allegiance going to be to like working and making a living or sticking with the union? There's even like the whole union man kind of rallying cry at the end, right before he walks into the factory.
Well, so what happens at the end is really interesting. So the white workers have been able to work during these riots. The black workers have not. And basically they're marching the black workers in with the help of the National Guard. The Packers are.
Well, it's a setup.
Right. It's a setup because what they're setting up is for a race riot. Like the Packers want to induce racial animus between them. And the white workers, I guess, are like trying to walk out at that point, or I'm trying to remember exactly what the scenario is.
Yeah, they're trying to hold off and not go into work for, it was like a couple more days.
Right.
And then the premise is, because again, they're using the black workers as a tool, as a pawn again to break up the union, kind of like what they were referencing, earlier on at the dinner scene you were talking about. So the National Guard escorts the black workers right to the front doors of this slaughterhouse. And then the National Guard, they look at the bosses. The boss does like a little tip of his hat or whatever. And the National Guard, they just split ranks and just walk away. And you've got this clearly heated situation with, the white union workers on one side and then the black workers right there. And then no National Guard, no protection, no help in between. And it's ready to kick off a race riot right there in front of the slaughterhouse.
And so what ends up happening? So what's happened is like Frank Custer, this is where the ambiguities that come in, right? Frank has his union pin. The other almost all the other black workers, there's one who joined before, have given up on the union at this point because the union wasn't there for them during the race riot, right?
Right.
Like what good does this do? He's still got his union pin, but he's also marching in with the other black workers because he doesn't feel like he has a choice. And after this moment, I mean, also his best friend from the South had been killed fighting during the riots, trying to fight back. He feels this deep, there seems to be this deep conflict. Basically, the white organizers in the union are able to walk the white workers out. Basically, they put themselves bodily in between. They replace the National Guard, and they walk them bodily out and avoid violence.
Right.
And then they march in, and so what is Frank Custer's position, right? He pulls out this is the end of the movie, we're basically trying. He pulls out his union pin and gives a speech about the need for a union for black workers, that you will never have your dignity without this, and that you actually need the people out there. You need the white workers out there. You need each other, and you need the white workers out there. And I think one of the things for me is, in a sense, for the first time while he's organizing, he's doing it as from within the black workers, as opposed to from the union outside.
Right.
So what he's done is, yes, he's crossed a picket line, really, but he's done it as a necessity for organizing the black workers in the long run.
Well, it's true. And he doesn't take he takes the pin off the outside, but he doesn't like throw it away or put it in his pocket. He pins it just on the inside of his shirt where it's not visible.
Right.
And I don't know. I mean, I've given Bill Duke credit, as the artist that he is. The way he pins it, it's right by his heart.
Ooh, yeah.
Which they don't really play it up with like swelling music or anything, but it's not on the outside anymore, but he pins on the inside, and it's right there by his heart. So I think you're right in reading that scene where it's like, okay, well, what role do I have now? Because it's still clearly something that's in him that he knows there's value too, but like, is this moment the right moment for that?
Well, part of what's happened also is during the riot, part of the Polish neighborhood is burned down. They blame Black people in general, and they blame him. These are the people who he'd spent time with, who he'd spent holidays with, who had been his friends, and they turn on him.
Yeah,
like that.
Well, because it was I don't remember who they actually say was there, but it was people in blackface setting the fires because they're trying to stoke this race war and cause division, which is effective.
It is. It's completely effective, right? So they're and part of it, you can see the Packers doing it from both ends, and it's this incredible struggle of ambiguity because of ambiguous feeling, because you may know you're being manipulated, but you're also seeing them react to it.
Right.
If they give in, can you trust these people?
Right.
You can't. I mean, this is a life and death thing. It's really. I mean, I think it's a really powerful portrayal, and I think it is carried by just sort of, I mean, a number of just standout scenes and just sort of, I know I keep bringing this up, but just killer acting.
It is. It's a movie, like I was writing in my notes as I was watching it, saying that it does have there is a certain TV aesthetic to it, but not to the level I was expecting of like, oh, this is American Playhouse production from the 80s, PBS. But what they have is stellar artistic work from everybody involved. Like I mentioned real briefly, the set decoration, it's amazing. The performances are all to a T awesome. They're pitch perfect the whole way through. You've got a very young Alfre Woodard in there. Always creepy Dennis Farina playing the killing floor supervisor. He popped up. Awesome 80s mustache. Still rocking that even back in the 80s.
You've got Moses Gunn. You've got
Woodard. Oh, for sure. Oh my gosh. Yeah. What a scene stealer. And it doesn't have it's like everything's firing on all cylinders, and I think it rises above the I'm trying to think of like what how to define that TV aesthetic. Like I guess the lighting in this movie. Like it's all just like perfectly lit like a set for the most part, because that's how you do it if you're shooting real quick. There isn't time to set up like this key lighting right here. I want to highlight this. Like it's hurry up and film it. But it doesn't take away from anything because it's so layered. I think the screenplay is where it started with me of like, oh my gosh, this is an amazing piece of work here, because it isn't just like like a rags to riches story of like, oh, he came to Chicago, made his fortune, got his family up here. Great. We're doing good. Like there's layers to it. There's a complex morality to the film too. That is really, really fascinating. One of the things I wanted to highlight as far as the production goes though, is they clearly did not have the production the budget to shoot the like a fictional race riot scene like that. That was a huge deal in Chicago. Like it's in the public record. Like it's a huge thing. That would have been a massive budget to recreate that, because you'd have like all of the damage to the build sets just to burn them down, to do whatever, let alone cast like all the people to do that. Well, there's footage of it though. So they use stock footage several times actually in this movie in a really amazing way to set the tone. Like, okay, here's footage of, this era of Chicago. Let's use this footage. And then since it is based on the journal of Frank Custer, you have a voiceover that Damian Leake, the guy who plays him in the movie, has recorded. So you have this like voiceover narration mixed with the stock footage. It gives you a great sense of place and time period. And it never really takes you out of it, because like, okay, what's the worst example you could think of using stock footage in a terrible way? Ed Wood. Like none of that stuff works when he does. In this one, it's pretty seamless, and it gives you a great sense of history, and then cut to amazing costume design, set design, acting, script, performance, everything along with that. And it makes it seem much more seamless than normally just, shuffling in some stock footage to show, a 19 teens Chicago.
The funny thing about that is, so this brings back primordial feelings for me, but the particular way they're using that, because it actually really does feel like PBS from the era, which of course is before I was born. But when you were a kid in the 90s watching a lot of PBS stuff, that aesthetic is kind of there, to be totally honest. This is not putting it down, because I think it's done really well.
Yeah.
It actually sort of hit me at a certain, like that sort of primordial level. I don't even know if I watched anything quite like this, but you feel it, right?
Well, that's what I'm having trouble. That's what I'm having trouble articulating, is that TV aesthetic. It's like a masterpiece theater vibe. Is that what you mean?
not even masterpiece theater, but it is. Yeah, it's like this is definitely a PBS. It's
Yeah,
definitely
yeah,
a
yeah.
PBS one. Using those clips. Here's your educational clip. But it's
Right.
not that, right? It's taking that style and applying it to this story, which I think you're right. It actually works really well. It's just a particular style. And I think the other area where you feel about it is like this is the sort of thing you would watch this as as a movie that you watch on a movie day, but it's surprise, it's educational because it's like it's based off of a real primary source. Did you know that?
Right.
Except the problem is it's an incredibly difficult, morally ambiguous, potentially you don't see a lot of violence other than against cow carcasses, but like it's deeply implied throughout. It's in fact not the movie. It's the movie that you hope you would have been shown
Right. Yeah.
because you'd be at that high a
Well,
level.
I would say some of the language there would have prevented some teachers from really
Yes,
showing it, but
there's extensive use of the N word,
right.
which of course is, it's period period accurate.
Oh, for sure. I also learned a new racial slur watching this film that I didn't know was a racial slur before. Peckerwood.
Oh yeah, no, that is.
It came up, and I was like, "Oh, that's the line from Back to the Future," because that's still one of my favorite movies of all time. And I was like, "Oh, that's he's the line in Back to the Future." So then I looked it up, and I was like, I did not know, that was. I just thought it was a funny line from Back to the Future. That's interesting. I have another one actually that comes up when we talk about Gung Ho in a minute, but so I looked up actually the budget for this movie. It was 1.2 million, which is, I feel like that's pretty sizable for an 80s PBS made for television film.
Yeah.
The I think it's Rosbach is the story was by Elsa Rosbach. So it was a little unorthodox since it was focusing on Chicago's labor history. Rosbach went around to dozens of unions. There's the credits. If you watch the credits, there's a long list of guilds and locals that contributed to the production. It says they just took up donations.
Oh, that is so cool.
A whole list of different unions and guilds that. Where's my note here? It's ranged from $1,000 to $300,000 from different guilds and unions that wanted to chip in to tell this story.
That is incredible. I did not know that, and that makes this all the more powerful
and awesome. What a collective effort to actually get this story told. This is where I throw it to you, Isaac, because was there anything maybe going on in the 80s in America as far as maybe an anti-union sentiment?
So it's interesting that two of these movies are from the 80s. And I think this movie, in a sense, I don't know why they did it particularly when they did, beyond the fact that, as you get farther out from the 60s, more and more sort of stories focusing Black characters and entering Black people into American history, in the way it's portrayed, not in its reality, are being made. But of course, the 80s is the Reagan era. We've talked repeatedly in previous episodes about the birth of neoliberalism. I talked about it, I think, probably during, I think most distinctly when we talk about RoboCop. But of course, you could say that the neoliberal era starts in the 70s, but of course Reagan brings it home with basically, in the early 80s, two things happen. One, you have Reagan firing the air traffic controllers when they go on strike, which is a signal to bosses all over the United States and in a sense the world that labor regulations are not really going to be enforced anymore, and you can go to town on this. It's not you're not just fighting the unions, you're going to crush them, and the government doesn't have a problem with this. The other thing that happens is what's called the Volcker shock. Basically, the 1970s, you have runaway inflation. This is a global phenomenon, but uneven all over the world. And basically, Paul Volcker, who's the head of the Federal Reserve, pumps interest rates up to, 20%, in an attempt to induce a depression-level recession and crush inflation. But what that means actually is crushing workers' demands and helping to break the labor movement. So what the Fed was doing was a form of class warfare. So this is basically a moment of crisis for the labor movement in which is being pushed incredibly hard. We see this in Gung Ho, which is our second movie. But it is something to have a movie about the labor movement in the mid 80s. Of course, part of it is that in the mid 80s, despite the fact that it's under deep attack, you have a much higher density of you're coming out of a period in the 1970s in which there's been huge amounts of labor militancy, and unions are still a lot bigger than they are now, because it's been continuous decline ever since then. So it's still more prominent. But yeah, no, I don't think I don't know if it's a coincidence that they're doing it right now. I don't know why they chose the story when they did, but certainly making a movie about the struggles of the labor movement. And this is the part of the reason this is such a good labor movie is that you're right. It, in the end, there is heroic union organizing, but it's not the triumphant strike. It is
Right.
we're going to keep organizing perseverance, that we did not allow ourselves to be totally crushed despite all of the divide and conquer and all of the tactics.
Right. Well, that's the arc too. Like you were saying when we started this off, of the main character is, the end. It's not like the victory of like, all right, job well done. It was like, gotta keep working at this. This is not over.
Right.
Which isn't like this was not the Hollywood ending that like we're kind of trained to expect, but it's like, no, this is what happened also.
Yeah. And it ends with pictures of all the different characters and saying what happened to them, and the union leaders, right, and the judge, who have histories that you can track. You find out what happens to them. They die after this. They do this. They do this. Our rank and file workers, who we've gotten to know, who are our main character, when the journal ends, or the materials that they're using as their primary sources are gone, they're gone. They don't exist they're gone from the historical record.
Yeah.
So part of it is, think how absolutely it happens, but think how rare it is to have historical movies that are about people like that. I think.
Right.
Am I off on that? I don't know.
No, I don't think so, because generally speaking, Hollywood, and this is like, a independent, PBS production, which I have a couple more notes on that before we wrap up. But if you read this story in the historical record, it's not one of those like, oh my gosh, this is totally a movie, because it doesn't hit the beats that Hollywood would expect to hit with this type of story. Because it ends, without like the triumphant, like, good conquers evil, kind of ending. It's like, oh no, that's realistic though, and this is what happens, or this is what happened. So no, it's pretty amazing. And Rosbach is credited with developing the project and working with historians and other screenwriters to get it made and written in the first place. So credit there for trying to get that story out. So apparently PBS was ready to produce a whole I think it was 8 or 10 historical docudramas exploring I have my notes. They wanted to explore little known histories of American workers. That was what they were setting off to do with this series. Unfortunately, Killing Floor is the only one that ever got made, was ever actually produced.
Part of my immediate question, which it wouldn't surprise me if this is the case, is if they face congressional blowback for trying to do something like that.
That's a good question. I do not know.
What's interesting about this is around the same time that, for instance, Gordon Parks in another PBS TV movie makes a version of the story, of 12 Years a Slave in the mid 80s.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Solomon Northup's Odyssey. That's in 1984, which we actually did. I did watch that a little bit in high school, and I remember thinking, hey, that's Avery Brooks, the captain from DS9. Yeah, because I've been slowly doing my Gordon Parks retrospective for the last few months, and he, sorry, this is a total digression, but I recently watched sort of his poetry / photo essay movie, sort of commemorating, dealing with his life, Moments Without a Proper Names, and Avery Brooks is one of the actors who's like speaking his words, and then. Oh, he's in the Solomon Northup story. There we go. But I wonder if that's actually related to that effort, or if it's just PBS was doing a lot of TV movies in the 80s.
They certainly were. So it could be that maybe that was too ambitious for, budgets that they had. I'm not sure. Yeah. So that I don't want to just speculate on that, but that was a goal. I wish there were 9 other ones to go check out, because that'd be pretty kick-ass. Assuming that they're all at this, high Bill Duke level of production and direction.
Yeah.
So speaking of high levels of production and direction, I can't do that with a straight face. I'm sorry. We have to talk about the movie that is Gung Ho from 1986.
Hey, Hunt, today is the big day. Give him hell, boy.
Hey, I'll give it to him.
We're counting on you.
Hey, Mrs. Broniak, this face is on the case.
Hunt Stevenson invited the Japanese.
You know, my dad was over here with the army in, I guess it was 1940. Hey, did you decorate this place yourselves?
To put his town back to work.
Welcome to your first day with the Sun Motors.
Now, everything is on his shoulders.
Let's do it and do it our way.
I thought it handled great.
And it's all in the hands of Ron Howard, the director of Splash and Cocoon.
This is great.
What could possibly go wrong?
Good question. Let's go find out. We must be a team.
In Japan, our goal is 0% of defense. How'd you slip by?
Everyone's thinking only of company.
See, we have our own way of making cars.
This is Looney Tunes.
Looney Tunes?
I've heard a lot of talk about how good the Japanese businessmen are.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't get it. I don't see it. I'm not impressed.
You're fired.
He's coming!
I can't stand it anymore.
Safety glasses.
You failed.
They're closing down the factory and going back to Japan.
I'm calling all the guys, and we're coming over to get you.
Oh, drown yourself. At least take off your watch.
I would love another chance. I know we could do better.
Can we do it? Can we do it? Can we do it?
Paramount Pictures presents...
I came to tell you were great tonight. I was really proud of you.
Michael Keaton.
Whoa, yikes. Whoops. Oh, whoa.
In a Ron Howard production.
Is it just me, or you hate the way your shorts feel when they get wet?
I actually kind of like it.
Really?
Gung Ho.
That's all, folks.
Ron Howard's film here, written by Lowell Gantz and Babalu Mandel, who he worked with often over the years. I picked out this one as the film for this particular episode because I've been meaning to go back and watch it for a while now. It was part of my adolescence. Growing up, Michael Keaton could do no wrong in our house. He fit my dad's sense of humor quite well. So I grew up watching, Mr. Mom and Dream Team and Gung Ho, eventually Batman as well, but like the comedies from the 80s that Michael Keaton was in. And for some reason, we didn't own Gung Ho on VHS, but I remember getting it from the library and then the rental store a bunch. I remember doing quotes in this movie because I thought it was hilarious. I don't know what about this one attracted let me see, we got a VCR. So this wouldn't have been right when it came out. This would have been the later 80s when I was watching it. So a 10 to 12-year-old me watched this movie at least 6 or 7 times. And I was like, this seems ripe to go back and look at. I mean, just the synopsis on IMDb. When a Japanese car company buys an American plant, the American liaison, played by Keaton, must mediate the clash of work attitudes between the foreign management and native labor. So I thought, this fits perfect for our themes we're looking at here. Being May Day and the month of May in general. Let's go give this a revisit.
In a sense, it does fit perfectly. And I think we're going to address everything, including the Japan panic and what it says about that 80s moment, because it definitely says a lot about that. But I first just want to say, part of what's interesting is just to say, all right, so The Killing Floor is a movie that deals with the brutal, hard reality of class struggle, the racial divisions stoked both by bosses, but also by workers themselves. And yet the need to persevere in the long term in organizing. It is a movie that should be watched by organizers and radicals and leftists and anybody who wants to make a better world. This movie, on the other hand, means none of those things. And in a very profound way is, I don't want to say the actual absolute opposite, but it doesn't. I will say this, though. Michael Keaton is funny.
Yeah.
I laughed more than I thought I would. It's also, can we just get the racial politics of this out of the way first?
Yeah, it's kind of the highlight, I think, that needs to be addressed within the movie. My way of introing this particular segment would be the movie opens with the Japanese characters that we will slowly get to know, kind of, in this narrative, just screaming. That's their intro, just screaming.
Because that is what Japanese people do, apparently.
That's what the Japanese labor force is about. We later learned that they're being, they're being shamed because they let the company down.
This is a special school for executives who fuck up.
Right. Which is also how we're introduced to Gad Watanabe's Kaz character. this movie is so close to being an actual perfectly like crisscrossing cultures buddy movie. You just need to give Watanabe more screen time, and it would be an infinitely better movie.
Yes, actually, I think it would be an infinitely better movie. I mean, here's the thing. We've sort of talked about portrayals of Asian characters before when we covered Gremlins in the 80s.
Right.
The Japan Panic is something very specific, which is like the 80s are a period, you have this massive induced recession. Basically, since the late 60s, U.S. manufacturing, which had been dominant, has been under a huge amount of competitive pressure. See, like the work of like Robert Brenner, for instance. Under a huge amount of competitive pressure by both German but especially Japanese firms, as Japan is growing at 10% a year through a lot of the post-war period, like China is today, or was today, actually a few years. That's not quite as true as it used to be, but it did for decades as well. So you have a Japan Panic in which it's like the Japanese are going to replace us economically, they're going to take over the world, and what is that? The Sean Connery one with Wesley Snipes?
Oh, Rising Sun.
That's like the worst example. It's like literally unbelievably racist. The Japanese characters are like barely human.
Yeah.
Like at all. Like they're just, it's, like you just relate to them like they're an alien species. It might as well be Star Trek. I mean, no, because Star Trek is good and this is bad.
Yeah, it's not as racist. It's not racist like Rising Sun is.
You see, I mean, we brought it up, I think, when we talked about like RoboCop. RoboCop 3 has this is this whole thing going on, and this is definitely a movie operating with that there's lots of racial slurs used by characters, but that's not necessarily seen as a good thing. There's lots of cultural stereotypes about the Japanese labor force and labor market.
That's the backbone of the quote-unquote comedy in this one.
Right. That is what it's about. This is not an excuse for any of this, but it's still not as racist as I expected. It's racist, but it's not as blindingly so.
I had the same reaction because I was braced for I was watching this with preteen eyeballs just like as a comedy because like Michael Keaton at that point, Mr. Mom, Johnny Dangerously, he hadn't gotten to Beetlejuice just yet, but yeah, I was like, okay, what was I watching back then? It was one of those like, oh God, I was braced for it. And it really wasn't quite the level it wasn't Rising Sun levels. You're right.
I mean, that's hard.
Rising Sun, but I was braced for that though. And it's not quite there.
Well, for one thing, Kaz is allowed to be, you're right. It's not a full buddy movie and would be better if it was.
But it's so close because by the end, the last act is a buddy movie.
Yeah, the last act is actually the buddy movie they could have made. But he's like a real character. Like you see his interior life, you see his family, you see his problems. They give you that. And
he genuinely like lights up a few times, which when Michael Keaton, when they first have like a little bonding experience in the office, Michael Keaton mentions like, oh, we have the softball team. And he's like, oh, I know baseball. I don't know softball. He's like, same thing or whatever. And he's genuinely excited. Like he clearly likes baseball. And then when they show up, that's a great scene.
It's a great scene. And
that's an actually like sincere, earnest, like kind of, I guess you can call it culture clash scene. It ends with George Wendt, and a baseball kind of hate crime. Yeah, Norm is just an asshole
in this whole movie.
But that's the way Ron Howard's going to balance out an 80s technically, like PG, I think, comedy is we'll just put some of like the worst stuff, give that just to one character who through his arc, learns a lesson or, whatever by the end. So it didn't quite steer fully into the racism I was expecting.
Yeah. Well, I think it's more subtle with it. And I think we need to get into what is the bigger, so basically Michael Keaton is sent to Japan to get this Japanese automaker. I mean, none of this is realistic. And we're actually going to get into real conditions in the American auto industry in our final film because it is a freaking fantasy in this. But basically, to a certain degree, I think. But basically, there's an auto plant in this small Pennsylvania town. It's been shut down. They're trying to get the Japanese to invest. He goes over, convinces the Japanese to come in. And then there's a culture clash because the Japanese want
a Japanese factory.
They want a Japanese factory. So I think I've talked about lean production.
Yeah, we did on the American Factory episode.
Right, where where you literally have
Oh my God, this is like
yes.
American Factory the movie.
This is American Factory, the movie, only it's not real and it's a comedy.
Yeah, and it's shittier.
And it's Japan instead of China, which has different geopolitical conditions. But yes,
it's the exact plot, though. Yeah, that's interesting.
It is the exact plot. Yeah, it is shittier. But go back to that episode to talk about lean production. But these are methods for like regularizing and controlling labor, and they're applied all throughout the American economy. As far as I know, and I could be wrong, I believe they are actually invented within the Japanese auto industry. So that's actually what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm just going to just say it. I think what this movie is about is getting American workers to, basically they're saying the Japanese need to chill out and we need to work harder because we're not working hard enough. We're actually not number one in the world. Like Michael Keaton basically has to give a speech.
He says that. Yeah.
He says that openly. It's basically American workers, you need to tighten your belts and get along with a little bit of lean production because we're not the best in the world. And it's fucked, actually. It's totally fucked.
Yeah.
But it is like, this is why it's an 80s movie, right? This is why it's a Reagan era movie, because you have this transition where it's not that labor unions are bad or even the strike is portrayed as bad. They do go on strike eventually over conditions. It's not bad, but like when the representative of their national union basically says, if you do this, you're not going to be in a union technically anymore, right?
Right.
Like, you need a contract. And they're just like, you're not here. We need jobs, which is actually literally like how the labor movement's destroyed, right? That's how outsourcing then causes people to lower, be too afraid to fight back. But they do it for comedy. And then, like in the real world, that's how it would happen. So that you're literally portraying that and basically like, well, we don't really, it's like unionism without a union. And with Michael Keaton as like the intercessioner who you don't need a contract or the strength of your labor. You just need Michael Keaton to like smooth things over for you. And eventually it'll work out because your Japanese bosses will realize that you're actually okay and everybody will work harder.
Well, because we know that's where the script's going to go. That same dynamic, though, actually is done obviously very much better, but it's in The Killing Floor as well.
How so?
Well, no, sorry, just the idea you're saying like, well, you can go do this job, but you're not going to be union anymore. Like, yeah. What's pulling you now? Like, I need to put food on the table. I need a job. Like, I need to, money.
Yeah.
So it really it forces you to readjust priorities. And you're like, well, fuck, like, there's, other humans I'm providing for. Like, I need a paycheck.
Whereas The Killing Floor deals with the moral horror of that situation and the incredible difficulty and the need to push past it. This is one where we will figure this out. Basically, you don't really need to be unionized. Like in the end, like It's not that unions are bad. We're not going to go for. We don't really need to be unionized. Like
right.
What you do is two members of management, because Michael Keaton is technically management by this point, and then the Japanese Kaz who's running the factory will go in and try to convince you to work harder to impress your new Japanese boss, and your gusto will bring you on through.
Yes. Oh, it's so weird rewatching it right now because there's so many little details that I was like, obviously I didn't notice as like, a 10, 11, 12-year-old watching it. But it's like you said, there's these little nuggets in there where you're like, okay, that seems legit. The opening sequence when Michael Keaton ends up heading to the floor. Actually, I want to talk about Mimi Rogers in a minute as his girlfriend. That's a really interesting character throughout this movie, but she's driving him to the airport to fly to Japan in the first place to make the whole pitch to, hey, come, we have this closed factory. You can put all these people to work. They're eager to work. They can't wait to work. You're going to have such a great workforce here. They go through this town and like most stuff is boarded up, if not on the way to being boarded up. Like without this, factory, like this town isn't going to exist. So it paints pretty realistic stakes, I think, for, a late 80s small town America. And then even when he returns home, he's been gone for a little while. And she even mentions like, oh yeah, the pizza place just closed up. He's like, wow, there's not even a pizza place in this town anymore. Yeah. And such is closing next week. And this one this week. Like it's nestled into this like shitty Ron Howard comedy, but there is a realistic portrayal of, some pockets of deindustrialization we're doing to small town America. Like this isn't a town anymore. And then she even has the line where, the only business that's doing anything right now is the guy who rents U-Haul trucks to people because everybody's leaving.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that part of it is this. It's really dealing with that deindustrializing mode, right?
Yeah. That's what was giving me as an adult watching it now. Again, I had nostalgia for it. You were watching this for the first time. Like, I always remember being in my living room. I always remember watching it with my dad. I remembered at one point we were even we made popcorn and watched this one and a Cleveland Browns highlight VHS reel tape that he wanted to watch. Like we did that as a double feature one afternoon because it was like a go-to comedy to watch. But now watching it with eyes in 2021 as an adult, I was like, man, they were aware of so much, and there's so many things in this plot where you're like, I kind of this could have, it was one of those it could have been better, I guess. I know they're going for laughs, they're going for a comedy from someone who's already Michael Keaton has already established himself as a comedic actor at this point, but there was enough stuff in there where I was like, oh, okay, that actually is pretty good. And then there'd be 5 scenes where you're like, oh god, this is terrible. And then there'd be a couple more nuggets. You're like, oh, that's actually interesting. Oh no, we're back to this. Oh, okay, now we're into it's such a seesaw mental exercise watching this right now.
I'm beyond the fact that it's based on the basic othering of
right. Yeah.
But the part of it is this: yes, if you could miraculously pull off that cultural stuff in a different movie, there could be a way potentially to do
I'm saying just up the buddy element, make it an even casting and even scenes. Because you go into Kaz's home and meet his family, it's too late in the movie. Show him from the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, so I think those are related, but not totally the same. You'd still have to just actually change the way you portray Japan and Japanese people, even though it's really...
It would help. That's all. Yeah. No, it's not going to fix it, but it would have helped. Also, because he's hilarious. That guy's a funny actor.
He is a funny... Well, they're both funny actors. Here's the funny thing is, when Michael Keaton's first in Japan, they don't even do nearly as many... the jokes they're making could be so much... I mean, they're not... Some of them are bad. The yelling jokes, whatever. Mm-hmm. But they could be... I mean, basically there's him getting on the... He just can't find his way to the right building. He gets on the wrong train. It's a bullet train. So he ends up in the middle of the countryside with a farmer.
Right.
Within 5 minutes. That's actually funny. That's a legitimately funny gag, and there's nothing wrong with it. That was just... I'm like, God, I think you're so right. This is such a... I mean, if we go beyond the politics and the racial politics and otherwise, at a pure quality of film level, it's just... Yeah, it's such a mixed bag.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of talent and basic craftsmanship that you'd expect. And then
yeah. And it's so close in a few scenes that you're like, ooh. Because then, you also have John Turturro in there. And of course, Clint Howard has to pop up for a few scenes because it's a Ron Howard movie. But it was like, oh, it's not that it was so close to being a good movie. It's just that there was signs of life in it where I was like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, okay, we're back onto this nonsense now.
Okay, yeah, no, I think that sort of sums it up. I mean, I laid out my thesis that this is insidious neoliberal propaganda.
Yes, no, I agree.
And in a very particular way that fits that '80s moment.
Yes.
I was gonna say, so the end of it shows the perfect melding of the two cultures, where the Americans who are lazy, which is not actually true. And not lazy. They're still hard workers, right? Because they made they could make cars before, but they're learning to do calisthenics the way the Japanese do before work, and they're listening to Working Class Man. Now, what is Working Class Man? I'm listening to this song, and I'm thinking, God, who ripped off? I love Bruce Springsteen. Okay, I think Bruce Springsteen is great, and it's a bad Bruce Springsteen ripoff.
Oh, the song in the movie. Oh God,
yeah,
the music in this music in this movie is atrocious.
It's really rough.
Ron Howard music montages are the fucking worst.
So, but this particular song, so I'm like, this sounds like a bad Bruce Springsteen ripoff.
Yeah.
Because the thing with Bruce Springsteen is he's always on the edge, right, of saccharine or parody almost, but he doesn't jump over it. Some people would think he does, but I don't think he does.
Yeah, I would say I think he does, but that's fine.
We disagree and we can fight.
That's
later.
Fine.
But I mean, you listen to any of his stuff about sort of literally a lot of the places that this movie is about, and sort of getting at the hardship of life, things falling apart, whatever. It turns out that this is one of the most popular and biggest hits in Australia of all time. It's by an Australian, and the reason it feels like a weird fucking parody is because it's by somebody who visited the US and went this is what Midwestern, basically white Midwestern workers are like. They like Elvis, and they're simple people who just want to get married, and this and that. And I'm just like, oh, I fucking hate this. But it's the same sort of demographic and pandering and image that brings us all the way, to the Reagan Democrats, all the way to the Trump era, in which some of the people now much older, in this movie would have voted for Trump, but are actually not the core base of Trump, because the core base of Trump is like exurban, like nightmare, like boat dealers. But still, and like real estate agents. But nonetheless,
Right.
they're sort of part of his imagined base and part of his real base. And so this is part of that conversation of like the imagined American working class that we've been doing for decades now.
Yeah, yeah. No, Norm, George Wendt in this movie definitely would have been wearing a MAGA hat if this movie was made nowadays.
Oh God, right? Like,
Yeah.
Just the fucking worst, Norm. Like, and I realize his name in this movie is not Norm, but
culturally, his name is Norm, I think.
Yeah,
that's
culturally,
what I'm
his name
thinking
is
of.
Norm.
Yeah.
And I like Norm. Okay, I like Norm,
Yeah.
and I don't like to see Norm like harass.
That's what hurts.
In a racist way, physically assault at least 2 people and have to be punched out.
Yeah, Michael Keaton beats him up in a grocery store because he's fucking with Kaz's wife and she's just trying to grocery shop and he's being an asshole. No, and Ron Howard also fucking sucks at picking out music. I'm just going to blame him. I don't know if that's him or not. The music in this, I wrote that like one of the songs is called Tough Enough. It's set to a musical montage where they're showing that they're tough enough. There's We're Not Going to Take It, Twisted Sister. Actually, that's a funny scene. I take that back. That one works all right. But The Working Class Man, I Can't Wait Another Minute. Actually, I think I wrote that one down. There's a whole scene where Kaz is at home and you see the American influence on his household, which I found was like, okay, this is actually this is legit funny. The Americanization of his kids. In one scene, you've got a Cabbage Patch doll. You've got MTV on the television. He makes a comment about no more Twisted Sister. His son is wearing fatigues, like army fatigue outfit. He's using a toy gun. He yells at his kid to read a book. And then his wife talks about mixing up Hawaiian punch and cooking Jimmy Dean sausage for breakfast. It's like, it's an awesome scene of just like shuffled together American commercials come to life in his house.
But see, I'm going to go after this hard. And I actually think this is part of the themes of othering racism. Why?
No, it is.
Oh yeah.
But like it's so close to being great satire, but Ron Howard's not doing it that way.
If you have any exposure to Japanese culture, even in the superficial way that we just get from like watching TV or watching movies, because Japan is one of the major like cultural, centers of the world, frankly, you would know that none of this level of materialism is particularly unique to the United States, and that Japan completely punch it out, and that these kids are exposed to all sorts of shit. Like at this point, they'd be the mid 80s. They would have like their like Gundam models and their whatever. I mean, it's like, come on. Here's the just to give a little more of the economic background for what's funny about the entire Japan panic. By the mid 80s, so U.S. manufacturing is in crisis because we've induced a recession. And also part of it is when you raise interest rates, that tends to raise the value of the currency. So the dollar is overvalued relative to its German and Japanese competitors. So there's something called the Plaza Accord in like 85.
Called the what?
The Plaza Accord.
Okay.
But basically, the United States makes a deal with both countries that they will basically that we're going to reshuffle currency values, because it makes your exports cheaper when your currency is cheaper compared to other currencies.
Okay.
And so they do that. This helps to, I don't know the whole economic history of this perfectly, so somebody who knows this better can say. But basically, this helps to induce one of the largest housing, building bubble. Like basically, like it's not just housing; it's like building, like commercial buildings, everything bubbles in history in Japan, which is like probably taking off right when this movie, or is going on right when this movie is going off. I mean, we're talking. Look this stuff up. The numbers are absurd. That's what's going on in Japan right now. Is a massive speculative bubble in real estate, which pops, and basically Japan never recovers, in a sense. Like Japan has never gets back to where it was afterwards. They're still a very wealthy country and important. But so part of the context of the Japan panic is by the time those movies are coming out, they're completely out of date with what's actually happening economically.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
And the image of Japan as like these hardworking whatever, it's like does not go along with like crazy like speculative real estate.
The reality,
deals.
yeah.
So like, which I mean, it's not totally separate from the reality of lean production and in crazy hours for like salary men and all of that, but it's not. It's based off of also just stereotypes.
Well, I was gonna say it's like Lola Gans and Bob Lou Mandel that wrote the screenplay. It seems to me like they watched maybe like one corporate video on VHS from a Japanese car company and was like, "Oh my god, I have an idea. What if we
What if we
blah blah
did
blah."
this one? And it's like,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. A couple other things I wanted to point out, just looking up stuff on the film here. I didn't know this when I was a kid watching this, but I did read that both Bill Murray and Eddie Murphy were offered the main role that went to Michael Keaton, and were like, "Yeah, no, I'm good."
Good call.
So picture this movie with Bill Murray in the starring role, or Eddie Murphy in the starring role, and what kind of movie would we have if they had said yes to this?
I know we're saying that this isn't technically like a good movie, but a movie with surprisingly good elements and a really fucked up package.
Yeah.
But and sort of the ideology. I mean, we're getting to our first two movies have gotten two sides of the ideology that like can be sent off by movies, about working class and two working classes.
Yeah.
But I actually think Michael Keaton would do a better job than either of them, and they're both very talented.
I think so too. I mean, I'm partial to Keaton just because I, grew up with him, and I obsessively rewatched The Paper like 50 times, and still, own it to this day. It's the one Ron Howard movie I actually like. Not a great movie, but still.
You don't like Rush?
I haven't seen Rush.
Rush is great.
Or Night Shift. I have a few deficiencies in Ron Howard, which I'm not scrambling to fill in. But
I have nothing against Ron Howard. I don't think he's bad. I don't think he's good. I think he does his job. I think Rush is actually very good. I have not watched. So my equivalent of this would actually be Apollo 13.
Okay, sure.
Which I need to rewatch because I haven't watched it since I was 11, and I would rewatch that loads of times. And
yeah,
I remember being very good.
Yeah, that one holds up pretty well. I've rewatched that recently with my son, so it still holds in there. I did want to point out too, as we wrap up this particular film, a scene that I 100% laughed at when I was a kid is the central premise to this movie too, I should say, is in order to save the factory, they're going to produce the same number of cars in 1 month that their Japanese counterparts can produce, which is like 15,000.
So it's not that their Japanese
or at their peak.
Yeah, the best month they've ever had.
The best month they've ever had was 15,000. Like, yeah, we can do it too because we're, Americans or whatever, blah, blah, blah. So part of the, I'm doing air quotes here, it's a podcast, you can't see me doing it, but like part of the comedy that goes with that is you're working nonstop, day, night, whatever. And so previously mentioned Clint Howard, who is of course in this movie because Ron Howard directed it. There's a scene that I laughed at as a kid that I watch now in horror. Even though it's played for laughs still, like the tone has not changed. Clint Howard on the line because they have to keep working and they cannot stop to make this quota. He has to pee in a bottle.
Yep. He pees in a bottle.
That means something different in 2021 than it did to my like 10-year-old eyes in 1989 watching this. It was like, oh, look at that. He's peeing in a bottle.
And, well, here's the thing is like, I think the next movie, our final movie of the night, is going to bring home that none of this is a joke, and that the portrayal of sort of soft American workers is bullshit, and that it was always brutal class war, and that factory work is dangerous and people get hurt. And when you do speed up, I mean, in this movie, there is a point where they're doing speed up, right? They're trying to get these made, and somebody gets seriously injured, and it's like, it's a horrible moment. It's not good for Michael Keaton. Michael Keaton gets beat up a lot in this movie. He makes really bad choices. And his girlfriend rightly, points out that he's a sexist pig toward her, and she's right. He doesn't deserve her, and he really doesn't.
No,
he really doesn't. But like that is actually not that. That's no. That's a heel turn. You're a villain. You are driving people to risk their lives. You can't. You need a sorry to bother you comedy to get across what that actually means.
That's what you need. Yeah, that's the tone you need.
Right.
Well, I mean, but they do use that in the movie because Kaz, Guy Watanabe's character, that's a breaking point for him because he was like, someone was just, injured here when one of his counterparts is like, get back to work, once the injured guy is walked off. So that is a breaking point for him in the movie plot-wise.
I mean, part of it is it's shown as a bad thing, but it's not. And it's shown as something that shows that style of labor isn't good. Doesn't bring home, no, there's a systemic problem here, but also that this happened to American workers anyway.
Oh, right. That's the problem with the movie, though, because it has the opportunity to learn a lesson or to drive home a point there, and then it just completely ignores it because by the end of the film, Well, actually, before we do the end of the film, because there is a really interesting end of this movie where I was like, I think you missed your own point here, film. What are you doing? I mentioned Mimi Rogers playing Audrey. She is Michael Keaton's girlfriend in the film. And there's a point where he goes over to Kaz, to his house, the plant manager, to have dinner when a couple of his other Japanese coworkers here, the bosses are there that run the factory. And Kaz says the line, well, before, they offer dessert. He's like, well, before dessert, we need to talk a little business. And all of the Japanese spouses get up and leave the room. And Mimi Rogers' character, Audrey, she stays, and she clearly is picking up on the social cue of like, I guess women are leaving right now. And then I think even Michael Keaton's character is like, hey, could you leave for a minute? She's like, no, I'm curious about what's going on at the plant. I want to be here. And at a certain point, as the discussion goes on, he just turns to her, he snaps, and he's like, would you shut up? And I was expecting this movie to stay, and I did not remember this part at all from watching as a kid, probably because it had to do with like a romantic subplot, and I could have cared less when I was 11 watching it. I was fully expecting this movie to go full like 80s sexist, and she leaves or whatever, but still sticks around. They get into a fight, then that fight continues in the car, and then she just gets out and starts walking and leaves him, and she's out of the script until he does a full-on public July 4th, I'm sorry, I lied apology to the whole town, and everybody turns their back on him. And she's like, oh, good, you got your moral backbone again. Are we done with this nonsense?
Yeah, but it's also part of him selling like neoliberal, you're not working hard enough story is when she comes back to him. Nonetheless, she's also saying good for not lying. So
right, I was going to say, yeah, it's more of like the moral lesson, but also the gender politics that are there, aside from the whole selling of the neoliberal agenda. But I was like, oh, that was actually refreshing. They gave her like a bit of agency, and she's like, I'm not putting up with this shit. I'm out of here, which I thought was kind of nice. So the end of the movie, they've got 1 day left. They've got to do I think it's like 1,000 cars in a day to meet the 15,000 number. All of the American workers are outside. They've walked off. They're like, I'm done. I think the injury was actually like their breaking point, right? They just like walked off.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly. So they're outside the factory, and then Michael Keaton, Hunt is his name. Hunt and Kaz, they both show up because they've gotten drunk together. They've started bonding. Again, Act 3, it's a buddy comedy with these two, and they're great together. They decide, you know what? We're going to go in. We're going to give it our best. We're going to do, good old American can-do spirit. We're going to go into that factory, us two, and we're going to build 1,000 cars, and we're going to hit that 15,000 number, and we're going to save this factory. It's going to stay open. We're going to keep everybody's jobs here. And all of the American workers are outside the factory, and they're like, oh, what is this? What is he doing? And they start working on cars, and they make a pretty specific point that if hours have gone by before the other workers that are outside the factory realize, wait, what are they doing in there? And then one guy, of course, was, says a perfectly written line. You're like, well, he may just be trying to save this town. And then everybody's like, oh, wait. And then they all go into the factory.
Yeah. You pointed out to me what this actually is.
But they're technically crossing the line, right?
I mean, that's what it starts with, is a couple of managers cross a picket line and then start doing the job. So they basically act as scabs.
Yeah.
And then convince the workers through their hard work to break their own picket.
Yeah.
Fuck this movie. Anyway, it's
But that's not addressed in the movie. That's what the movie does. So it's like this movie's operating in this space where like you're doing something, but are you even aware of what you're doing with your plot right now? Oh, you're not. Okay. Oh, this is confusing.
Yeah.
But it's done as like a triumphant like comedy scene too, because they put together a bunch of half-assed cars that literally fall apart in the last scene.
It's not. There's part of it is the actual ending to this movie. I mean, even by the standards of the movie, is incoherent. Like
it's absolutely incoherent.
There's no reason that this Japanese boss should like, yeah, I can see your gumption.
The big boss of this whole company who's in visiting literally walks up to Michael Keaton at the end and is like, you know what? We'll keep the factory open because pat on the shoulder. You make me laugh. You're funny.
Yeah. That's
credits.
Here's the thing: this is how Japan and the United States can get together, because Japan ultimately isn't that threatening. This is part of what's weird about the Japan panic is the whole thing is, of course, Japan isn't that threatening because one, they're not actually going to overtake the United States economically. It's not going to happen.
Right.
Two, they're deeply geopolitically aligned with the United States and part of the U.S. imperial U.S. military umbrella, so they're never going to actually take us over. Like, there's tens of thousands of U.S. troops based on Japanese soil, specifically in Okinawa. I mean, it's absurd. Unlike China. And ironically enough, Hollywood cannot vent our need for Chinese villains because the Chinese market is too big.
Right.
Talk about how film is becoming irrelevant as an art. If it can't if it can't bring across our neo Cold War jingoism, what good is it?
Right.
Should we move on to our third feature?
Yeah, let's wrap this up with finally got the news ... from 1970.
So what is this documentary?
Oh, are you asking me for the pitch?
Yeah.
Okay. Again, thanks to Letterboxd, I was poking around looking for labor films, and of the two of us, to be fair, I'm the one I'll steer a little bit. I'll steer more often towards documentaries than you do. And I was like, I bet you there's some great obscure documentaries that I'm just not aware of or haven't been elevated, that didn't make it to PBS, that didn't make it out somewhere. And some fantastic user on Letterboxd had mentioned, like, finally got the news, this documentary about the Detroit's League of Revolutionary Black Workers and Drum. They produced their own basically protest documentary in 1970. So it was like, oh my gosh, this is an amazing like stopgap between the depiction of World War I slaughterhouse workers that we talked about with the killing floor, but then it also leads directly into the shittiness of Gung Ho in 1986. Interesting kind of stop along the way. So now we've seen an attempted interracial union organizing in the teens. Now we've got actual documentary film proof of 1970s organizing, which I feel like was actually better suited to be like towards the end of the killing floor, because this is specifically about black workers in Detroit in 1970.
I know you were bringing up that we should bring it up right after the killing floor, and I wanted to bring it up after the auto movie.
Yeah,
because it's another auto movie. But
it's another auto movie. No, and it makes sense. I get it.
But no, you're not wrong either. I mean, part of it is this is the next generation out, right?
Right.
Or maybe one more generation out, because you have the 1930s generation. And now, I mean, a lot of the workers involved in this who are building up this independent labor movement, which is being attacked by the cops and attacked by the unions that work with the companies.
Uh-huh.
Part of it is these are, once again, people, a lot of them are people with organizing experience in the South because they come through another wave of the Great Migration from the South. So that's who a lot of these workers are. So it's direct generations, right? There's direct connections here into sort of tradition. What's interesting is that they're not actually, they attempt early on to maybe do interracial union work. They basically say it's impossible with this. And so they just decide to organize black workers while hoping that militant white workers will organize white workers. And I think I watched this after I watched Gung Ho, and this is some of the most interesting Marxist these organizations. It doesn't come across necessarily, but it does come across in these movies, because so much of the analysis they're laying out is like, some of it's very not original Marxist analysis, and a lot of it's very original. And people like James Boggs and Grace Lee Boggs come out of this, who are like some of the most original and interesting American Marxist thinkers there are. But they're really laying out like an analysis of American capitalism and a lot of the things we saw on the killing floor in, now 40 years later, or more than 40 years later.
Still there.
Are still there, still the dynamic.
Black workers have historically been the foundation stone upon which the American industrial empire has been built and sustained. It began with slavery over 400 years ago, when black people were captured on the west coast of Africa, shipped to the United States, shipped to what was then the colonies, and used to produce surplus value. Under slavery, the amount of surplus value which was extracted from black people was enormous, because of the fact that the only thing that they got back for it was food, a minimum amount of shelter, and a minimum amount of clothing, just enough to procreate, to produce another generation of slaves. That is, the capital which was used to build industry in Europe and America essentially came out of the cotton trade, out of the textile industry in the 17th and 18th centuries. And from a basis of that industry, railroads developed, steel developed, and all the various other elements that went into the development of a modern economy. The process of the extraction of surplus value has continued in this country, and it's been especially hard, on black people. Just as it was in the beginning of the development of capitalism, not only in America but throughout the world, black people provided the foundation stone. You'll find that throughout the history of America, the black people have been in that same position. You find that's true today. You don't find too many black people as white-collar workers. You don't find too many black people who are skilled tradesmen. You find other kinds of cats, who are sitting in the factories, who are actually converting raw materials into finished products through their own sweat and blood. I mean, that's essentially what it is. It's a transformation of sweat and blood, literally, into finished products. So when you think about this, in terms of black power, in terms of, the kind of power which black people have as a people inside of this country, and you get all the arguments that, they only 10% and they will be wiped out. You can't wipe out the hand that's feeding. We're essential and key to continual operation and continual smooth functioning of a highly industrialized, highly complicated machine. And we can use that power, if we ever get ourselves organized well enough to destroy that machine or to take it over.
Just to contrast with Gung Ho, you should watch this after Gung Ho, because after you've heard about how soft American workers are, and then you hear about the actual living conditions, one of the things that happens in Gung Ho is they're complaining about overtime. But one of the things in the big, with the big auto manufacturers, is very clear in this movie, is they have forced overtime. You're paid for it, but you have no choice but to do overtime.
Right.
So it's bullshit, right? Like, it's total bullshit.
It's an interesting documentary because I actually, so I think that was also the way I watched it. I watched this one after The Killing Floor, and I went into a documentary, and I just came off of a PBS production. I guess in my head, I was expecting it to be like, a PBS style documentary, one of those like, Ken Burns American Experience things. This movie has a vibrancy and an energy to it. And I think it's because it's made of the movement. Like it really kind of plays almost like an anthropological documentary. Also, I'm watching it, decades later. So that probably adds something to it, but I still should say it's free streaming on YouTube, so it's very easy to find. Just finally got the news, ... 1970. You'll run across it very easily. But it keeps it very, it's so visceral. There's some parts where it kind of lags a little bit to me where it's speechifying. Luckily they have great speakers, and they're getting across really interesting points. A lot of it relies on kind of montages of what looks to be pretty covert footage of the factory in some respects. Again, very much like American Factory, who we referenced already, or Closing of a GM Plant, the Kelly Reichardt, Steve Wagner film that we covered about a year ago.
Except that it's the workers themselves. Well, actually, it was the workers themselves doing that too.
Right. Well, some of the covert footage that they got out of the factory there as well. But it's a really interesting mix because it's workers' thoughts and opinions about what's going on, what they're doing, how to organize, with just random shots of like the town and the factory itself, a lot of exterior shots. But there's also some interesting like lecture scenes. I don't know. It's a really, I don't want to say mixed format because it's all film, but it's like mixed narratives throughout this whole thing, which is really interesting.
I mean, it's sort of unfocused in a certain sense. It flows a lot. So, at a certain point they start. It's
like jazz, Isaac. It doesn't have to flow perfectly. It's just, it hits all the right notes at the different times.
Okay, fair enough. I'm going to tell you, it's sort of when you get to the end, I mean, there's a little bit of shoehorning in, but like good shoehorning. I mean, so
sure.
Part of it is like partway through, you start getting interviews with white workers, right? And you start. So what this is, I mean, I guess Detroit has a similar dynamic to Chicago in the same period, where these are like mainly clearly people who've just come out of the South and Appalachia, who've come.
Oh, right.
And part of it is you're hearing them talk about the bosses and how only a few people have things. Laying out a cogent analysis of how they're being fucked by exploitation.
Right.
And then they end with a quote of somebody saying, well, some people get more than others, like, black people. And, which is a line that could come out of the Reagan era or any time afterwards about, they're getting handouts.
Today.
Today, easily. And so part of it is that they're clearly illustrating, like, look at these workers who have so much class consciousness, but the racial propaganda prevents these white workers from seeing these things. And over again, they point out the black workers are going to be the vanguard of organizing because they're the most conscious, which is interestingly enough the opposite of the Killing Floor situation.
Yeah.
So,
well, what a difference a few decades can make.
Right. Well, decades of organizing.
Right.
I mean, what is sort of indicated, but not total. I mean, they're clearly anti-imperialist. You can see like the Che Guevara stuff. You see the connections to Black Power. If you read more about their organizing, and I think this is the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. The Detroit Revolution is one of their constituent parts, like the organizations that creates them. But like you can see the way that they're. Well, I mean, if you only get little indications of this, but if you read more about them, it's like struggles against police violence, struggles against all these things come together along with the labor organizing because it's never separate. The very end of the movie, like the last 5 minutes, this is the shoehorn. They talk about Black women workers and their conditions and how they're going to end up in the factories soon too, and that basically that the bosses think that Black women are going to be more desperate and easier to control, but they have no idea.
Right.
And it feels like it's both an important political point. You know why they stuck it there. You also feel like they kind of like could have given that a little more room to breathe. But it's a really interesting display of their analysis in the moment. And yeah, it's an incredible document. I'm really glad you found it.
I think I texted you about it. I was like, oh, this is like a time capsule documentary. It's not. Doesn't have to be the most polished, doesn't have to be like the best thing you're going to see this year, but you're like, it is so an of the moment artifact or piece of work that it's definitely worth watching.
Yeah. So, and I think it connects deeply to our first movie and in contrasting ways, but also like captures that and then really puts the lie to the narrative that Gung Ho is laying out about the condition, to a certain degree. And, it's easy to check out because it's on YouTube.
Right. Absolutely. I don't know the availability, but Stuart Bird, one of the directors, did a movie about 9 years later in '79, another documentary with Deborah Schaefer called The Wobblies. So Stuart Bird is definitely doesn't have a ton of films to his filmography, but when he makes a movie, he has a very specific focus.
Yes.
What he wants to document there. So
he may be interested in the labor movement. It's possible.
Yeah. I think so. I think he's got a thing he's working on there. So as May continues, Isaac, what do we have on deck for our next episode?
More labor. Yes.
Yeah, we have sort of our own theme going this particular month.
So we accidentally created dueling themes, which we hope will come together. I think this episode came together really nicely, but these are our only factory movies. From here on out, I basically I noticed as I was trying to find labor movies that like 90% of labor movies are about mine workers.
And well, the ones you were drawn to.
No, I'm pretty sure it's just 90%.
Oh, that's just it. Oh, okay.
I'm pretty sure. Come on, Meituan is miners. Every labor movie with Valley in it is about miners. They're all about miners.
That's true. Yeah.
Well,
it's very stark. It gives you great visuals for a visual medium.
And it tends to be where some of the most brutal historic labor struggles are.
I mean, yeah, for good reason.
So I'm basically only going to do miner-related films. Instead of running away from the cliche, I'm going to run straight into it, and we're going to cover them because they're great labor films.
Well, also, there's so many on your list that you've wanted to see previously anyway. You're like, hey, let's knock some of these out.
Why do you have to reveal that I'm cheating? That like these are all on my list, and I just want to get.
It's not cheating. I'm just saying, like, it's one of those like, hey, let's find. Hey, I the movie I picked for next episode, I haven't seen it either. I've always meant to, and I'm looking forward to jumping into it.
So what's your theme for the month?
Well, I decided to take a look at how the service industry is represented, and that can mean a lot of different things and a lot of different jobs. And the first one I picked out to take a look at is Car Wash from 1976.
It sounds awesome.
So what's the first minor film, Isaac?
My first one is 1954's The Salt of the Earth.
All right.
Which will also, I think, continue some of our themes about race and labor.
Yeah.
So in this case, with Chicano or Mexican workers.
Nice. Well, we are going to see what we come up with by putting those two films. I'm going to go on a limb here. I'm going to say there has not yet been either a film podcast or a double feature booked at a movie theater that put together Salt of the Earth and Car Wash ever. So I feel like we have a few firsts coming up this month here by doing these kind of pairings. So I'm curious to see what we're going to come up with.
People, get your friends to listen to this podcast because they're not going to get this anywhere else.
Yeah, where else are you going to get this? Come on.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of friends and this podcast, we would invite you to rate and review us in whatever podcast app you are using. And we are up and running on, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, the usual social media platforms. So give us a follow there if you're interested. We post stuff outside of what we're just talking about on the show. Although, to be honest, in May, it's going to be a lot of other labor films probably that we are not getting to on the show, but we'll be recommending or posting about throughout the month as well. So until next time, I am Aaron Spears.
And I'm Isaac Miller, and stay safe out there as you go on strike, because the Scabs and the Pinkertons, like literally the Pinkertons, like the Pinkertons still exist. It's insane. Scabs, Pinkertons, they're out there, but we can beat them. We can overcome them. We can create a better world. Workers of the world unite.